On a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby. Peter Abetz is the Western Australian State Director for the ACL. Peter, a special welcome back to 2020.
Good to be with you, Neil.
Peter, let's start with something that's national, and then we'll zero in on some of those things that are more specific for Western Australia, your stamping ground. But let's talk about something that affects every Australian, this mis- and disinformation bill that's being proposed. Certainly that's interesting for every listener who's concerned about privacy and freedoms. What's the latest from your side?
Look, the Mis- and Disinformation Bill, as it's known, the official name actually is Communication Legislation Amendment Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. It's quite a mouthful, so everybody just refers to it as the Mis- and Disinformation Bill. It's actually not a bill before Parliament yet. It's an exposure draft, as they call it, which is, I guess the government is trying to test the waters to see what reaction there is. And basically, what this bill proposes to do is to require the social media platforms to have policies in place to prevent mis- and disinformation that could be harmful being disseminated through, circulated through their platforms. And of course, the big question is, what is dis and what is misinformation?
So if you're defining those, I mean, we might just be thinking whoever's saying the wrong thing, leading people astray online, that could be classified there, but the government's got some more deeper definition there?
Yeah, the bill defines disinformation as when a person puts stuff up they actually know is false and they do it deliberately to deceive or mislead people. And I think most of us would agree, hey, that's fair enough, that scams and those sorts of things, if you know something is not true and yet you're trying to deceive people by peddling it, that something needs to be done about that. I think most people would feel comfortable with that. But the problem is the misinformation. They define that as something that you believe to be true, you're convinced it's true, but somebody else, namely the authorities, consider it to be harmful and not true. And of course, how is that going to work in a situation of freedom of speech? Like, for example, I believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and that his dying on the cross took away my sin. Now, there would be some in authority who would say that's poppycock. They would accept that I believe that very deeply and I'm convicted of the truth of that. But if they consider that harmful to other people because it might have some psychological detrimental effect on them, who's going to make those decisions? And the way the legislation is framed, ACMA, that's the Australian Communications Media Authority, that's what it stands for. So the Australian Communications Media Authority, they will be the final arbiter of what is truth and what is not. And that is really problematic.
So this is the issue, isn't it? It's who decides what's true. And when you've got an open and free society where you can debate all sorts of things, to have some sort of arbiter that is going to define what's true and what's not, that actually creates a real problem for a free society. How do you see that even as being something like of a threat for the freedom of Australia into the future?
Look, I see it as a very major threat because the reality is that there's different opinions, different understandings of things, but it's by having free and open public debate that usually the truth eventually filters through to the top. Like we've seen it with how to treat children with gender dysphoria, for example. The use of so-called puberty blockers was supposedly fully reversible, and anybody who said they weren't fully reversible was had posts taken off their social media, and they were claimed to be misleading people. Well, now the medical opinion is united that they are not reversible, and so it's by allowing people to express different views and so on that eventually the truth bubbles to the top. That's how science works too. So it really would, if that kind of idea were to kind of law would be allowed, we'd all still believe in a flat earth, because that was the common belief, and it was considered wrong to say it was a sphere. But eventually, through public debate, we got to learn the earth is in fact a sphere.
So the real danger here, Peter, is that there would be a body who would be able to engineer what the truth is. That means really shaping public discourse. It even could mean swaying how elections go and the outcomes, and promoting various ideologies one over another. And it's really who's in charge as to whether those sorts of things happen and to what degree. So, I mean, if the government's got this as an exposure draft right now, are they inviting for people to have their say? Is there a submission process? Is there something you can speak up to right now? What are your thoughts here for listeners who are thinking we need to take some action here?
Look, the time for submissions, I understand, is closed, but certainly, like ACL put in a submission back in August, I think that's closed, but people can certainly communicate with their federal members of parliament expressing concern. And perhaps I should just make it clear that it's the social media platforms, they are the ones who will have to make the decision, because the Australian Communications Authority, Media Authority, they will not actually say you have to take this post down, but basically they're saying a social media platform that does not have adequate policies to keep mis and disinformation off their platform, they will fine them up to 5% of their global turnover. So it's massive fines, and inevitably what will happen is that the social media platforms will actually self-censor, and so they will plan to err on the side of caution in what they will allow to be posted, because, hey, they don't want to get fined.
So the government would be encouraging, I guess, as it does now, some level of self-censorship, self-regulation, and therefore the ACMA would become a backstop. But anytime you've got a backstop that can be the arbiter of truth, you're really treading on really dangerous ground. Thank you so much for a great update on that. Hey, let's get a little focus on some of those issues that are bubbling along in Western Australia. Back in September, there was abortion reform legislation. Give us your insights here, because somehow I suspect that people don't realise just how serious those reforms were in Western Australia. What's the latest from your end?
Yeah, look, the bill passed late September and has now been proclaimed, so that's the law of the land, and I would say it's probably the most liberal or draconian abortion legislation in the world, because basically under this legislation you can now have an abortion even if you've got a perfectly healthy baby right up until the day before baby is due, as long as you can get two doctors to agree that it's appropriate. The idea that you can kill a baby for psychosocial reasons, when in fact if the mother would give birth to it, it would be a perfectly healthy baby, perfectly able to survive, that is, I think, really abhorrent. So that's one of the tragedies of this legislation. The other is that basically you can have an abortion up to birth for pretty much any and no reason, and what was really disappointing was that the amendment to ban sex selection abortions, that was voted down as well. It was quite concerning, actually, because all parties were given a conscience vote on the bill and any amendments that were coming up, and it was every member of parliament in the upper house from all the different minor parties and the Liberals and the Nationals. They all supported this amendment, and only two of the Labor people supported it, that meant it wasn't enough to get that amendment across the line. But the general impression we got was that the Labor members were under tremendous pressure not to accept any amendments whatsoever to this legislation. And sadly, since the McGowan government won that massive landslide at the last election, they haven't actually allowed any amendment to any piece of legislation that's gone through the upper house, which really it's very unhealthy, because it really means that the upper house is not functioning as the house of review.
It's almost one of those absolute power corrupts absolutely along the lines of this type of ethical issue when you start to see that there was no amendments allowed at all on that abortion reform legislation. Just on a personal note here, Peter, because you're mixing widely throughout Western Australia. You're listening to the thoughts that people are having as you travel around the state. What are you hearing from people? Did they realise that this abortion reform legislation had gone through in September and it was now law and that it was the most liberal in the world? Do people realise, or do they have to be pinched? Pinch yourself here because this is the reality. What are you hearing from people?
Look, the mainstream media actually gave very little coverage to this bill going through. They sort of made a big thing about the fact that it was taking abortion out of the criminal code. Nobody been prosecuted for the last 25 years, so it was really a bit of a non-event. But they focused on that. They did not mention at all that it allowed abortion right up to birth for psychosocial reasons. I would say that 99% of people in Western Australia would be unaware of that aspect of the legislation. And it's an interesting one, because I think even a lot of Christians who generally take more interest in the abortion legislation, I'd say most people would be unaware of that.
And more legislation, no doubt, coming down the track. WA not yet, in some sense, caught up with all of the dreadful things that have happened in some of the other states. Issues like conversion therapy laws. That's on the agenda in WA, isn't it?
Yes, the government, in response to the Esther House report or inquiry, said they were going to introduce gay conversion laws, or banning gay conversion laws, as it's popularly referred to. But we haven't actually seen any legislation as yet. I think it was, I think it was December last year, if I'm not mistaken, that they announced this. But we still haven't seen any legislation. And so we just don't quite know what's going to be. Although the Attorney General, when he made that announcement, he did state in that media release that the legislation would permit psychologists and medical people to counsel people around that issue of gender identity and sexual orientation. I think highlighting that they didn't want to go down the path of the Victorian legislation, which actually makes it a criminal offence to pray with somebody, for example, if a person asks for prayer, that God might help them overcome their gender dysphoria or their sexual same-sex attraction. So we just, my sense is that the government doesn't want to go quite down the Victorian path, but the LGBTQ activists here are very keen to see the Victorian-style legislation because they consider that the gold standard, whereas I would consider that's the most draconian in the world.
Well, when it criminalises Christian ministry, we've been drawing attention to that. And, of course, a lot of that legislation has passed, and there needs to be some sort of a groundswell for people to speak up and say, wait a minute, criminalising Christians who are helping people who have an unwanted same-sex attraction, that just is a step too far. Let's talk about a few of the other things. There's a potential for a revised Equal Opportunity Act in Western Australia. This is all about Christian schools and their ability to hire the staff that will go along with the Christian school ethos. What's the development there?
Well, the government called on the WA Law Reform Commission to review the Act a couple of years back, and the Law Reform Commission did the report, and they've given that to the government. The government has announced that they broadly accept all the recommendations, and a lot of the recommendations are pretty mundane, but there's a bunch of them that relate to the Christian schools, as you've mentioned, or faith-based schools, so it affects Jewish, Muslim, Christian schools equally. And basically what they want to do is they want to remove the right of faith-based schools to give preference in selecting staff or giving preference to people of the faith of the school in their staff selection process. So, in other words, if you're looking for a maths or a science teacher, you're not allowed to prefer someone who's a Christian. If you've got a Christian school, you've got to disregard their faith. And if an atheist teacher would have similar qualifications or better experience, then you're really would be obligated to take the atheist. And of course, it really fails to grasp the reality that faith-based education is not just about imparting facts. It's actually about the children in the school seeing the Christian life modelled, and that you actually create a faith community. And if you are not able to give preference to people of the faith of the school in staff selection, that really undermines the whole function of a Christian school. The only situation where they recommend you should be allowed to give preference to people of faith is for chaplains, principals, and religious studies teachers.
Well, this is one of those things, isn't it? As you really quite beautifully there define, what is it makes a Christian school? It's more than just a delivery of facts. In fact, if you took the Christian teachers and the staff out of the equation, what would make it a Christian school? So that's something I imagine that you'd be wanting to make sure that Western Australian listeners in your neck of the woods would be right on board with some of the things that are coming up so far as initiatives that are coming from the Australian Christian Lobby, particularly for WA listeners right now. Peter, is there something that you're asking people to get on board with, just to connect with you, to be a part of any initiatives that you've got coming up, to alert people that these things are happening?
Yeah, look, what we've actually done an e-petition on the parliamentary website. In fact, today is the last day they can actually sign that petition. It closes today. It's a petition that calls on the state government not to proceed with this legislation until such time as the federal government has clarified what they're going to do with the Australian Law Reform Commission report, which basically recommended the same kind of thing. But one of the things I've done is I've run a few Zoom trainings with our supporters and just give them some ammunition how to argue this issue. Because what I say, for example, is if it's good enough for a Green senator, if he had a staffer who woke up one morning and said, you know what, I think climate change is a load of garbage, the Green senator would want to have the right to terminate the services of that staff, because he just doesn't fit the ethos of that office anymore. And in the same way, if a staff member no longer embraces the Christian faith, he just doesn't fit into that into the ethos of that school, and therefore the school should be able to terminate their services. And I think that illustration is one that really resonates with people. So I'd encourage people to get on the parliamentary website. That's the WA Parliament. If you go on the Get Involved tab, and then you've got e-petitions, and go down to that, and you'll find the petition there, and you can sign. It only takes a minute to do that. So that would be really helpful. The other thing we're doing is, with the federal members of parliament, we're actually having little delegations visit the federal members. We've covered nearly half of the federal electorate already, our members rather, and so we've got a few more to go. But I'd certainly encourage people to write letters or make phone calls to their state and federal members about this issue.
Just quickly before I let you go, of course, with the absolute power in the lower and House of Reviews in Western Australia, some of this legislation we're talking about is likely to appear, I guess, probably next year. This is a sort of, what about the church? Is the Christian church, are the leaders all united? Are there people who are speaking up? Is there a way that some agitation can happen here? Is there a sort of an appetite amongst Christians in Western Australia to speak up? What are your thoughts here? Because I think an election's about 18 months out. And, but are churches agitating and speaking up loudly enough? What are your thoughts here quickly?
Churches generally not. The Christian school movement definitely has, And the Muslim leadership has also spoken up. In fact, I went with the Muslim leadership to see the Attorney General about the whole issue, and made our position very clear that we considered it unacceptable. But interestingly enough, they still have not introduced the revised Equal Opportunity Act. And one of the journalists wrote an article a week or two back saying he thinks the government is actually stalling on both the gay conversion and the Equal Opportunity Act because they don't want another bun fight, because they've lost so much support with the Aboriginal heritage legislation that the Liberal Party is actually sort of within range now in public opinion of actually possibly being able to win the next election. And so the last thing the Labor government wants would be a big bun fight with the faith community, which could reduce their support even further.
Well, that would be a big turnaround, wouldn't it? If the Liberals were having a bit of a resurgence because it was a absolute walkover loss at the last Western Australian state elections. So if there's a resurgence that's happening because people are understanding that sometimes overreach has dreadful ramifications, that could be a very significant thing. Hey, I've got to draw a line under our conversation here, but always appreciate your great insights, Peter Abetz, for listeners to take advantage of being your signatory to that last day of that petition, that e-petition you were talking about around Christian schools. Let me point listeners to the Australian Christian Lobby website, acl.org.au, acl.org.au, and to keep informed and up to date with other initiatives that are going on. That acl.org.au website is going to be a real treasure for you. Peter Abetz, Western Australian State Director for the Australian Christian Lobby. Peter, thanks so much for your update today on 2020.
Pleasure to be with you, Neil.